The next critical question comes to my mind is how efficiently is copper flowing through the trade channels, especially during periods of this tight supply. To address this, cannot be anyone better than Mr. Dhawal Shah. And Mr. Dhawal Shah is a partner at Metco Ventures LLP India, a leading player in metal scrap and secondary alloy trading with an established global footprint across more than 40 countries. With over 26 years of deep rooted experience in the metals and recycling industry, he brings a rare combination of commercial insight and policy engagement to the sector. Over the past decade, Mr. Shah has held several influential leadership roles within the prominent national and international industry bodies, actively shaping the growth and the institutional development of the global recycling ecosystem. He currently serves as an executive committee member and treasurer of the Bureau of International Recycling at Brussels and as Senior Vice President of the Material Recycling Association of India. In addition, he is a member of the Metals Committee at FICCI. Mr. Shah has worked closely with Government of India on critical trade, regulatory and policy matters concerning to the metals recycling industry, contributing to the framework that supports sustainability, supply chain, and resilience and responsible sourcing. His perspective sits at intersection global trade. Over to you, Mr. Dhawal.
Thank you, Binaji. I'd like to thank Metal Trends and Big Mint on organizing this webinar on a commodity which has become, I would say, a center point of all global discussions. Now, the velocity at which copper has traveled, I think, is causing a lot of stress in Indian households. The other day, my wife outsmarted me by saying that each year I keep buying small quantities of gold and silver, knowing where its value will be today. Now, since that you spent 26 years in the metals business, hope you would have done the same in copper. Indeed, I was dumbfounded and had to concede that foresightedness is legendary, just like every other housewife in India currently. But one thing that I realize is that by my beloved metal copper is now being spoken in the same breath as being put in the same league as gold and silver, which is truly beyond comprehension till about a couple of years back. Nobody had thought of that. So, anyways, as I had mentioned to Binaji earlier, that my focus today would be more on the secondary side of the business. Now, since we've entered the new year, there are some important events that we need to capture as what happened in 2025, and then perhaps look at the road ahead of us. So in terms of India's secondary copper and copper alloys, I would say it's mainly dominated by brass. The current production stands at about close to 360,000 tons. Now, to produce this, about close to 35% of the raw materials, that is scrap or we call it the recycled resource materials, is met through imports. It's imported into India and the balance is procured locally. Now, one of the biggest events, and we've spoken about it, the other speakers have spoken about it, was the suspension of the basic customs duty on imports. For last several years, MRAI, BME, and other trade organizations have been relentlessly telling the government of India that that recycling is India's fast-track lane to increase production of refined copper and to meet the growing demand and simultaneously expedite the green transitioning goals. Further, it makes our downstream products more competitive and empowers Indian producers, again, imports of value-added items, especially from the FTA countries. So finally, they decided to suspend duties on all metal scraps, except for the case of aluminium, which again beats all logic and principles of rationality. Today, secondary aluminium production represents about close to 35 to 37% of the overall aluminium output. We import around close to 85% of our raw materials, which is amounting to nearly 2 million tons. So besides the larger good of environment benefits, imagine the competitiveness of such a large industry internally and for exports as well. In today's time, levying duty on recycled resource materials is regressive and an act in isolation, as most countries around the world do not have this. So anyways, that's on the duties. And then we also spoke about the rescinding of the BIS's QCOs in copper. which again was perhaps a barrier blocking supply chains rather than enhancing consumer safety. So I think the overall theme that the previous speakers have spoken and what really the pitch today is that the ore supply is short and recycling or recycled copper is the best alternative when it comes to capacity for building, growing copper production in India. Now, to give a perspective, I think India imports, even on the mining side, it imports 90% of its needs in terms of raw material, the ores and concentrates comes through imports. But for recycling, because we've highlighted that how important recycling of copper is, there are some specific and monumental challenges which I want to talk about. I think the first one is more like a thematic one. I think the seeds of this was sowed during the beginning of the trade war in the early 2018 when Trump administration first got into power, the first term. I think after about 8 years of jostling, pushing, cornering, this trade war has broken into many different forms and actions, tariffs, trade quota restrictions, export duties, carbon thresholds, the CBAM we talked about, and just plain economic sanctions. Now it's now a game just not for securing, but also protecting and controlling resources, namely energy and critical minerals and metals, and including scraps from end of life materials, which are perhaps now considered as the most economical, potent raw material feed in resurrecting local manufacturing. But why India needs to worry, I just want to give you a little perspective on that, is because our demand for copper is growing in double digits. We expect by 2030, somebody said 2.8, my guess is about 3 million tons of demand that we'll have. Our ore supplies are getting squeezed, the quality of it is degrading, and there will be a lot of dependency on scraps. That is a recycled material at smelter levels. The smelter capacities are expanding. Now, with our low consumption base, I think the domestic generation and supplies would remain inadequate. Plus, there are issues related to, for domestic purchasing, there are barriers, I would say, or some sort of a hindrance related to bogus billing, mainly because of the GST, which is not allowing large scale consumers to freely participate in local sourcing. So we, as India, as a country, we need to pull up our sleeves and, in managing our scrap supplies. And that's where it starts to get complicated. You see, there was a slide before we talked about certain restrictions coming up from Europe. I just want to make it a bit more granular there. So Europe's waste shipment regulation has entered into force in the year 2024 and on May 20th, this came into effect. Now, this regulation has been adopted as part of the larger EU Green Deal and the new Circular Economy Action Plan. Now, the original aim of these policy or this particular act was to ensure the environmentally sound management of waste generated in Europe to prevent illegal shipments and to increase traceability of waste shipments. But the main point here is that come the summer of 2027, there will be a net ban on exports of EU waste into non-OECD countries where India is, which is India included, unless and until the countries and companies receiving them aptly demonstrate their capabilities, matching, in terms of EU's own framework, environmental framework, labor norms, everything that, that India has to demonstrate that they are able to compete or they are able to match that. Now, this is a very tedious task entailing company level registrations, approvals, audits, post material receipt compliances on treatment, disposals, consumptions, everything will be monitored through an electronic exchange, which will be set up by EU. Now, I think most of you would perhaps know that starting 1st January 2025, that's last year, under the WEEE regulation, exports of electrical and electronic waste was already stopped. It was banned. It was blocked. So all these items like motors, compressors, cables, etc., they got blocked. Therefore, all of these units which got stopped from Europe, they now need to be substituted. And not only this, as part of raw material security for domestic manufacturing, EU is already investigating a case of applying limited export quotas with or without duties in case of aluminium and steel. Now, decision of this will be made in the next couple of weeks, but things could get worse because today they're talking about aluminium, steel. The Critical Raw Materials Act could also sort of entail copper. So that's EU for you. Now, across the Atlantic, if you move, US, which is one of the largest exporters of copper scrap in the world, there have been calls by the domestic producers to put a ban there as well on exports of scrap. There have been interventions from trade organizations like REMA and other big scrap processors. So it has been averted for now. But we all know that under the Section 232, US has put duties on aluminum and steel imports, but has left copper because they want more copper. I think the total domestic capacity is about 850,000 tons, plus an additional similar quantity, about 870,000 tons coming through scrap recycling. But the total need is about 2.5 million tons, which is a shortfall of about almost 30%. So for now, the copper scrap export has been allowed, but I mean, in future day and time, even this might get clogged. If you come closer to home, UAE, again, that has an export duty on copper scrap. And likewise, there are restrictions in other Middle Eastern countries and Africa where they want copper scrap to be value added before it kind of, or possibly get down into downstream manufacturing rather than just being exported in raw material form. So again, on policy front, I think India will have to think hard in terms of its engagement with other countries, which allows free flow of raw materials. We are just about to finalize our FTA with European Union. Maybe as part of that, there is work that will have to be done internally in terms of opening up supply chains and making Europe sensitized in terms of the need, what India needs, and perhaps try to figure a way out. And likewise, even early on, I spoke about GST. I think this 18% GST on scrap is sort of acting as a barrier in terms of local domestic sourcing. So even the government perhaps will have to look at that. So all in all, I think my sense is that with China's demand growth in copper dropping or tapering in the last quarter, the prediction of 2026 not showing any substantial demand spike. Perhaps at some point, I'm just getting on the pricing front that this is my view that the profit taking could happen. The squeeze in ore supply is for real now, but at some point, even that may ease up. The buildup of the inventories in the US will also be unlocked once the decision on import tariffs is made in the next couple of months. So while the logic and law of gravity tells us that what goes up must come down, but right now the law of chaos says, and it's screaming that what goes up may go up even higher. Now, depends on what you believe in, but I would say that as far as raw materials are concerned, as scraps are concerned, India right now is severely dependent on overseas right now. And I think the government will need to get into an overdrive, making sure that the smelters receive copper scrap from everywhere, just not imports. Of course, imports is the mainstay, but even domestic supplies, as whatever that they can do, they need to open up these supplies. Yeah, that's all from my side, Binaji.